Hello, welcome to the third episode of Enigmas of the English Alphabet. In this episode, we're going to talk about the evolution of the alphabet. On the previous episode, we saw how one of the most important factors and the one that can cause more confusion is the fact that in Latin there's only 5 vowels, but in English there can be more than 15 vocalic sounds. So let's review the evolution of the alphabet to help us understand how this happened. To understand the situation, let's forget about English for a moment, except for the fact, of course, that I am speaking English, and let's do a quick review of the history of writing in general. The concepts that we will review can be found in all the words in all languages that use the Latin alphabet, including English. So these facts underlie all the writing of Western languages. Now, at the beginning, knowledge was transmitted orally. Traditions and stories would pass from generation to generation. Now, the interesting part of this is that some of the old languages were more elaborate than modern languages. In other words, they involved abstract concepts. They followed rules. They follow declensions. In other words, changes in the words according to gender and number, as an example. And they were not simple languages. This was especially true in Old Egypt, Babylon, Persia, and one very interesting case is in India, where the Vedas, as an example, were collections of old stories which were passed orally from generation to generation. Just the Rig Veda alone was a collection of 1,028 hymns and 10,600 verses. And this, again, was passed from generation to generation without change. It was very important to keep the sounds without change and the words without change. Using the right sounds had special connotations, sometimes, and in many cases, were considered sacred. The Iliad and the Odyssey were also transmitted orally, and they were long, complex works. Some of the first graphic representations can be found, for example, in the Altamira caves, where we can see very beautiful scenes of animals which probably were the center of a story that was shared by the tribe and where knowledge was communicated from one generation to another. Eventually, we can see in Egypt a very sophisticated system where hieroglyphs were used to represent stories and words. Each hieroglyph became a word. Now, these images are very beautiful, very complex, and very difficult to produce. The problem with ideographic representation is that you need to learn a lot of symbols, thousands of symbols, in order to read and write the words of a language. So this learning could take a long time. It was also difficult to coordinate and standardize the symbols so that they were kept consistent from one place to another. Now we see this type of writing still in use in China, and a Chinese person needs to learn several thousand of symbols to be able to read and write. The advantage of the ideographic writing is that it is not linked directly to the sounds, and then you can see people using the same symbol to represent words that are different. This we can see in China. Even though they speak different words, they can understand each other using some of these symbols. Syllabic script was a further development. In this type of writing, each symbol represented a syllable. All the languages of Chaldea and Babylon, as well as Semitic languages, use different set combinations of vowels and consonants. If we use the word dinner, D-I-N-N-E-R, as an example, the combination D-I-N, din, and the combination NER, NER, will have two different symbols. So this word will be represented with two symbols. And these symbols could be reused. They could be reused and recombined to represent different words. Now, in this scenario, we still need hundreds of symbols, between 300 and 400 symbols, to represent all the possible combinations. So syllabic scripture allowed the simplification of writing and made it easier for a scribe to learn to read and write, and the simplification of symbols allowed for a more consistent combination. Now, the old scribe was on one side a religious profession, but on the other side, it was a practical profession. Many of the engineers, architects, mathematicians, and technologists of the time were scribes. One example of this profession was Imhotep, who was not just a scribe, he was also a doctor. He was a sage, a religious leader, an architect, and had many other professions, and participated, for example, in the building of the pyramids. He was a wise man who knew all the arts and served the pharaoh. Now, one of the most important parts of the scribe's job was to register all the events, and this included a clear representation of sounds. The great majority of ancient cultures had a very specific pronunciation that had to be followed exactly. The exact phrases had to be pronounced in the correct form, and it was of the utmost importance to keep this pronunciation. Eventually, in Egypt, they started representing not just one word with one symbol, but one sound with one symbol. In other words, a hieroglyph would represent a particular sound. This was the beginning of the phonetic scripture. First examples of phonetic scripture can be seen in the so-called Proto-Sinaitic writing, which eventually turned into the Phoenician alphabet. So the alphabet, which was a hieroglyph for the ox, evolved into the Proto-Sinaitic Aleph, the Phoenician Aleph, and eventually the Greek Alpha. The Hebrew alphabet was initially a copy of the Phoenician alphabet. The Hebrew alphabet was a variant of the Phoenician alphabet. The actual symbols changed because in Hebrew culture, you're not allowed to represent living things. However, the names of the letters remain the same as in the Phoenician alphabet. So in Hebrew alphabet, we have Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, etc. Hebrew scripture, even today, keeps the tradition of Semitic languages, and they do not represent normally vowels in their words. Since the combination of consonants usually have the same vowel, they only represent the consonants. If there is an exception and they need to represent another vowel, they use a system of points. The next important development in the alphabet was the Greek alphabet. Greek was a lingua franca in the old world and set point. And you wanted to listen to works from Plato and others, you had to learn Greek. Now, the Greek alphabet basically adapted the letters of the Phoenician alphabet, changed them a little bit, and gave them different names. The names they gave them was alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, etc. Now, in the English word, you can hear this alphabet pronounced as alpha, beta, gamma, delta. That's not the traditional pronunciation of Greek. The correct pronunciation is alpha, beta, gamma, delta. Those were the sounds that were used at the time. Now, the main characteristic here is that, and this follows the tradition of the Phoenician alphabet, is that the sound is given in the first part of the letter. So alpha represents the sound A, beta represents the sound B, gamma represents the sound G, etc. So the key of the pronunciation of Greek is in the alphabet, just like all the other versions of the alphabet before it. You have alpha, beta, gamma, you learn all the alphabet, and then You just start using those sounds and you can read the words of the language. This made it relatively easy to learn. You still have to learn the words, and if you're not immersed in the language, then you have another level of difficulty. But once you learn the basic sounds that are in the alphabet, you are able to read the words of Greek. So in this episode, we have seen how the evolution of scripture went through a simplification process that took it from being a system where ideas and then sounds were represented graphically, and a system that was difficult to learn, a system that took a long time to learn, and it was difficult to create. A system which forced a student to learn thousands of symbols and different interpretations in order to be able to read and write a language, to the syllabic system where you had to learn just 300 or 400 symbols, and then eventually to the alphabetic symbol where you just had to learn 26 symbols in order to read and write the words of a language. This allowed for the democratization of culture and facilitated the learning process. It allowed culture to spread quickly in the old world. The alphabet allowed a scribe to represent almost every sound of a language using just 26 symbols. Of course, this is dependent on the simplification and standardization of the basic sounds of the language. And it was true that those languages had a limited number of sounds. In the next episode, we're going to see how the Latin alphabet is the result of this evolution and how it includes techniques which demonstrate a knowledge beyond what it seems at first glance. I'm going to add a link to my YouTube channel where you can see a video version of this podcast, including all the symbols that I have been discussing. I also invite you to visit my website, enigmasoфenglish.com, and you can send any comments to alvaro@phonicsense.com. That's PHONICSENSE.com. Alvaro, ALVARO, at phonicsense.com, PHONICSENSE.com. Thank you.